So far I've mainly been talking about selflessness or emptiness with regard to the persons, because for one thing, it's said that even though we have ignorance with regard to all phenomena, but the ignorance that we have with regard to our own self, I, me, this one here, is very problematic, because if we believe in a real I, which is not realistic, not in accordance with reality, then based on that we have self-centeredness and obsessiveness about our I, and then based on that we get into all kinds of afflictive emotions. We get angry and hateful towards those we regard as enemies, threats. We have strong attachment, desire, clinging to those we regard as helpful, friends. And then we have indifference towards everybody else, which is based on ignorance, not seeing their true nature. So in this way, we have these three poisonous states of mind, of attachment and hatred and attachment and ignorance with regard to other people, other beings, and also phenomena. So based on these attitudes, we then create karma and create the cause to suffer. So all of our suffering mainly comes down to not seeing our own I, me, myself in a realistic way. And does that make sense so far?
Yes.
Yeah. So they usually say when you're trying to develop an understanding of emptiness, it's good to start with your own self, your own I, me. How do I exist? Okay. And there are different levels or different layers of misconceptions or wrong ideas we have about ourselves. So I'll just write some things on the board. The blue didn't work very well. Let's try the green. Oh, black. Okay, so emptiness, selflessness. So now let's use that word, emptiness, with regard to the most gross or coarse level of this is emptiness of I'll just use the abbreviations because it's easier that way. PUI. Permanent, unitary, independent. Permanent, unitary, independent self. Okay? So that's... Does that mean something in Hebrew or something? No, okay. Phew, phew. So this is the kind of self that non-Buddhists believe in, such as some of the Hindu schools. A permanent Atman, real, eternal, independent of the body and mind, and so on. So Buddha said no such thing, doesn't exist. So, but we have to investigate. We shouldn't just take the Buddha's word for it. Buddha said, you check it out for yourself. So we have to check. Is this true? There's no such thing as a PUI self. Okay, that's the most coarse. And then a bit subtler than that, this one I will write out just because we haven't talked about it before, but it's a mouthful of words. No, sorry. Yeah. Well, okay, let's keep it simple. It's called a self-supporting, substantially existent self, but I'll just keep it simple. Substantially existent. Self-supporting, substantially existent. That's number 2 on that list at the bottom of page 2.
What's SSSES?
Huh? What?
SSS?
Yeah, we can call this SSE. No, S-S-S-E.
You say double S.
Self-supporting, substantially existent. Just to keep it simple. Okay. Now, we're going to go on. I'm going to explain what this means in a little while, but let's just hold it for now. And then the more subtle one, and this is the one only Prasangikas talk about. This is the inherently existing self. Inherently existent self. Yeah, we could call this IE. IE self. And this is the most subtle. So this is very coarse. This is just coarse.
What do you mean when you say coarse?
Sort of not subtle. Maybe it'll become more clear as we go on. I mean, this is considered very coarse because, for one thing, not everybody has it. It's not something naturally existing in everybody's mind. Only those who have studied philosophy or religion that teaches this kind of self, they learn it from their teachers, and then they take it on. They accept this idea, and so they say it's only intellectually acquired. It's acquired intellectually by studying with teachers who tell you, you have this kind of self. But it's not something inborn. Whereas these two, the last two, are inborn. According to Lama Tsongkhapa anyway. We are born, everybody, babies, newborn babies, first open their eyes, they already believe. they already think. They have a substantially existent self. I mean, if it's not intellectual, but it's an innate thing, an inborn thing. And they also believe in this one. So these two are inborn or innate. Everybody has. Even babies, even dogs and cats and mosquitoes. All living beings have those two.
You can say that the first one is a view of self and the other two is a sense of self.
Yeah, if you want to say it that way. So according to Buddhism, none of these three types of self exist. There's no permanent unitary independent self. There's no substantially existent self. There's no inherently existing self. So these kinds of selves don't exist. But what does exist are conceptions in the mind that believe in them, that see them and believe in them and experience them. So those do exist. So that's the real thing we're trying to target. We're trying to work on those conceptions in the mind. And like in the case of these last two, these conceptions are not things that we have developed on our own or learned from others. They are innate. We're born with them. Buddhism says our mind has no beginning. It's always been existing forever. And these conceptions have always been there in our minds. This is quite different than what some people in the West believe, that a newborn baby has a completely pure mind. Completely clean and clear and pure. And then they just learn. What's that term? Yeah, that idea. Who came up with that idea? Oh, really? It goes that far back. Okay. Anyway, Buddhism doesn't agree with that. A newborn baby's mind is full of full of ignorance and imprints from previous lives, imprints to get angry, imprints to have attachment. So it's not the case that the anger and attachment a baby experiences is something they learn from their parents, but they already have those tendencies, and they're just ready to be awakened.
And you can see some babies are really very calm and very quiet, and some babies are like
Very angry, yeah. Yeah, just not long ago talking to one mother who had 2 children, and they were like that, completely different. One is very calm and very peaceful, and the other one so angry, full of rage, right from the beginning of their
And
life.
as a mother, you feel guilty because it's your.
No, it's not the mother's fault.
There's always an opportunity to feel guilty. Always.
Not in Buddhism.
He was, we were all mothers.
Sorry.
Everyone has been our mother.
I forgot that.
So I had this idea. It was just an idea that came into my mind, but I didn't learn it from my teachers, and I just thought it might be a helpful way of understanding these different conceptions of self. So Tal's friend kindly loaned us a babushka doll. So I'm going to see if I can use this to illustrate. Okay, so we do exist, okay? We are a person. We are a living being. We're not saying we don't exist at all. The idea of selflessness or emptiness isn't like wiping us out of existence. We do exist. We do have a self. And so this, I'll use the smallest doll to refer to that self that does exist. Now, the self that does exist would be explained differently by the different schools. But just to keep it simple, I'll go with the Prasangika's view, which says that the self that does exist is the mere I, or merely labeled I. Okay, we'll get to that later, what that means. It's not actually so easy to understand. And in fact, what they say is, in order to understand the merely labeled I, you have to first understand emptiness. You have to realize emptiness first. Once you realize emptiness, then you can understand how the I does exist, the actual way the I exists, that it's merely labeled. Okay, so that does exist. So let's say that there we are, merely labeled I, merely labeled Sigal, merely labeled Tal, merely labeled Susie, merely labeled Shuki, merely labeled SK, okay? So there's a merely labeled I. Okay, that does exist. But because of these imprints in our mind from beginningless time, we have let's start with the most subtle. We have a belief in inherently existing I, which means not merely labeled, but existing inherently, independently from its own side. So such an I really doesn't exist, but we think it does. We have this conception that thinks there's an inherently existing I. Okay, so that's this one. This is the inherently existing I. It's only fabricated by the mind, but still, you know, it's kind of covered over. That's why I thought the babushka is helpful. You know, it's sort of a layer, an additional layer on top of what is there. Okay, and this is the I that we see and we think is really there. I'm a real, inherently existing, independently existing SK or Sigal or Tal or Shuki or whatever, you know, inherently existing. But that's still relatively subtle compared with the next level, this one, the coarse one, which is the substantially existing I. Okay, so that's a little bit more coarse, a little bit more, and I'll explain in a little while the difference between. It's not so easy actually to understand the difference between them, but it's another layer, another level of a misconception about our I. that make sense? I thought this helps to have something visual. And so this is, everybody has, okay? Everybody has. We have a merely labeled I that does exist. And then we have these two layers of wrong ideas about our I. The inherently existing and the substantially existing I. So we have these two layers that sort of cover over the I that does exist. So that we can't see it. And we're not able to see, just like we can't see the little babushka in the middle, we cannot see the I that does exist, because it's sort of hidden behind these misconceptions about the I. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Sort of? Then some...
The merely labeled I is also a misconception.
No, it does exist. It's something that exists. But we don't see it. We don't experience it because we are confused. We are ignorant. We are...
You need to get
And we mix.
you need to see emptiness.
We mix, yeah. We'll get to that later. We'll get to that later. So everyone has these two misconceptions about the I, inherently existing I and substantially existing I. And then some people, in addition to this, have this more coarse misconception of a permanent, unitary, and independent I. So that's another layer.
Repeat it? Sorry, I didn't.
Okay.
Sorry.
Everybody has these misconceptions. Some people, those who have studied with a teacher in a certain philosophical system or religious system or whatever, and have been told that they have a permanent, unitary, independent I, they will have that conception as well. So that's one more layer on top. So you can see the little babushka inside, the one that does exist is getting more and more kind of covered over with these other layers, so that, it's like more misconceptions. So we can't see. Yeah, there are, yeah. I'm using, this is really just a rough analogy, we shouldn't think it's exactly like this, but it's more in our mind, we think that we exist in these other ways. Okay, we have these ideas, these conceptions of an I existing in these different ways. In fact, these kind of I's do not exist. They're false. They're fabricated by the mind. They don't really exist. But we think they exist. We think they're real. We think they're true. And so we grasp onto them. So our job in the spiritual path is to gradually remove these different layers. And you can't get right to the, just like with the doll, you can't just immediately get to the one in the middle, right? You have to take them apart one by one. So we may not have this one. We may not have this one if we haven't studied with a teacher, with a system that teaches us that we have that kind of self. So we may not have to deal with that one. But that's up to you. Each one of us has to check. Do I conceive of myself in that way? And if we do, we have to investigate if that's true or not. But we do have these two. So we have to check, well, first we have to recognize. You've probably heard this expression, this term, object of negation.
It's more
Object of negation. Tibetan, they call it gagja. Gagja. Just for those who want to know. So, object of negation. The object of negation, there will be various of these. So the object of negation would be, in this case, the different false or mistaken or non-existent types of self. So the permanent, unitary, independent self is an object of negation. Okay? So we have to first check, do I have this kind of idea? Do I believe in such a self? Do I see myself as existing in that way? So we have to check and identify that object of negation, and then go through a process of investigation, reasoning, analysis. Does it exist or not? Okay. And in this one, the object of negation would be this self-sufficient or self-supporting, substantially existent self. I'll just shorten it to substantially existent self. So again, that kind of self is an object of negation. So what we have to do, the process, is to first identify the object of negation. Okay, see it within our experience, that kind of a self, that kind of a sense of self. That's a good expression, actually, a sense of self, a sense of ourself existing in that way. So we have to identify that, and then again go through a process of investigation and analysis and check if it's true or not. And then the subtlest one is the inherently existing self. So again, we have to recognize the object of negation. That's the inherently existing self, sense of a real, independent, intrinsic, inherent I. So we have to recognize that and then go through a process of investigating if it's true or not, if it exists or not.
So you start with the PUI, you do this systematically, and after that you move to the SSSE, and then you move to the IE. So
Yeah, because, well, like I say, normally the Tibetans, they just shoot right to this one, right? They just go straight to this one, the last one. But when I was doing the master's program, the teacher there, Geshe Tenzin Tempel, who was our teacher, he said that we cannot realize the emptiness of an inherently existing self if we haven't already realized the emptiness of the more coarse kinds of self, substantially exist. It's just not possible. And to me that makes complete sense. It's just like the babushkas, you can't get to that smallest doll in the middle without removing the other ones. So that's why when I'm teaching this subject, I try to talk about it in this way, because it just makes more sense that we have to start with a more coarse level and then go to a more subtle one. So last time we looked at this one, the PUI self, and I mean, if one had more time, one could spend more time investigating that, and just check. Do I see myself as a permanent, unitary, independent self? And even to recognize that, it could be a little subtle. Because most of the time our minds are just so busy thinking about all kinds of things. Even though we feel a sense of self there, but our mind is so busy with other things, we don't think that much about ourselves. And how do I exist? What is myself? How does it exist? It's not something that we normally think about. And I think realistically too, one's mind needs to be relatively calm and quiet to be able to do this kind of investigation. In fact, I've been doing a lot of reading recently about this whole topic of selflessness, and I came across one article that said that in the Theravada countries like Thailand and Burma and so on, this whole idea of selflessness is regarded as the domain of monks, monastic people, but not lay people, And it was probably like that in Tibet as well. The lay people, they're busy, with their work, their farms, their cows, their yaks, their business, and so on. They don't have so much time to really do this kind of thing, you really need a lot of time to study, to think, to debate, to meditate. So lay people normally don't have that kind of time. But in the West, I think, a lot of lay people, all of you are lay people, but you're interested, in this kind of subject. But to actually realize emptiness, to actually get a realization of emptiness, I think it does take quite a bit of time. It's not easy. In fact, just recently I was talking with one monk who has been studying in one of the monasteries in India, Ganden Monastery, for, I don't know, at least 15, 20 years, because he's finished his Geshe studies, but now he's he's joined what they call the Larampa class, which is going for the highest level of Geshe degree, which is another 6 years. So, and I was saying, oh, you know, I'm teaching emptiness, and if I have any questions, could I ask you? And you could help me? He said, oh, I don't understand emptiness.
Wow.
Okay. Like, after that many years of studying in a monastery, they spent at least 4 years just studying emptiness, just studying Majjhimika. So if you've done all that kind of study and you still say, I don't understand emptiness, it just shows. I mean, I'm sure he's being humble. He must have a much better understanding than me, but still, it just shows how difficult it is, how it's not something we can just easily grasp. But still, it's good to put whatever time and effort we can into trying to understand it. So any questions so far? Oh, I mean, yeah, I'm sure you got a zillion. Shuki?
It's a question from the previous session.
Oh, okay.
Who practices Chittamatra?
Yeah, that was my question.
Well, I think that it's alive and well in Japan.
Okay.
Another name for Chittamatra is Yogacara. Yogacara. You may have heard of that. Yeah.
The mind-only school is Zen.
It's just another name. There's Chittamatra and Yogacara.
Yeah, it's the same.
They're the same.
They're the same.
As far as I know, I mean, there might be some differences, but I think in Japan, in the Zen tradition, they follow that school.
So then it's that school?
It seems like it. I had a book once about Yogacara philosophy written by a Japanese master, but I didn't have a chance to finish reading it. So,
I mean, because that's a pretty big difference between that and Prasangika Madhyamika.
yeah.
I mean, it's
Still
I mean,
Mahayana.
Zen is supposed to be in the Mahayana.
Yeah, Chittamatra is Mahayana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're in the Chittamatra.
Yeah. Probably in China as well. I think in China they had many different schools. So they did have Majjhimika, but they also had Yogacara. So people can choose. I mean, the Buddha taught all these views. He taught them for different types of people. Majjhimika isn't suited for everybody. So if you're not comfortable with the Majjhimika view, you got these other views to choose from. They were all taught by the Buddha. But the Tibetan Lamas say, well, yeah, but only with the Majjhimika can you really get out of samsara and get to enlightenment. So that's their, yeah.
I had a question I wrote. Is there a person who realized emptiness and forgot? Like, is there a person who once was enlightened and sort of contaminated it with things?
I mean, it is, huh?
The whole idea of Bodhisattva is someone who is enlightened and now is helping everybody, but he cannot really pick up on other pollution.
A bodhisattva is not enlightened. A bodhisattva is someone on the way to enlightenment, like a medical student, who's not yet a doctor, but is training to be a doctor. So bodhisattva is not yet enlightened, but has this determination, I want to become enlightened, I will become enlightened to help all living beings. So they're still training, they're still practicing to become enlightened. And there's different levels of being a bodhisattva. The very first point where you become a bodhisattva is when you develop bodhicitta to the point where it's natural and spontaneous. You don't have to try to generate bodhicitta, it just comes up naturally. So you've been training yourself in the methods for developing bodhicitta so much that it gets to the point where it's just natural and spontaneous. So that's the point where you become a bodhisattva. And to reach that point, you don't have to realize emptiness. You would probably know about emptiness, but you are not required to have realized emptiness. But after that, to continue on the bodhisattva path, you do have to get a realization of emptiness. But the first realization of emptiness that one has is still conceptual or intellectual. And when you have that kind of realization, it can I can't remember now, but I think it can degenerate, maybe. Yeah, I think it can. You could forget it, you could lose it. But, let me finish. But then eventually one needs to increase one's understanding of emptiness to the point where it becomes a direct realization of emptiness, a direct experience of emptiness. When you reach that point, there's no going back. There's no falling back. So it depends what kind of realization of emptiness you have, whether you can fall back or lose it or forget it or not. Depends on, does that make sense?
Yeah, it's first bodhicitta and then emptiness.
No, not necessarily. It could be the other way around. It's possible to realize emptiness first, have an intellectual understanding of emptiness first, before generating in fact, they say the really sharp faculty, they have this terminology, sharp faculty and dull faculty, which can sound like more intelligent and less intelligent, but my teacher said it isn't like that. It's a sharp faculty means more energy, dull faculty is a little less energy, something like that. So they say a sharp faculty bodhisattva will realize emptiness first before they generate spontaneous bodhicitta, and a dull faculty might realize emptiness afterwards. So it could go either way, but you definitely have to have both. You have to have bodhicitta and realization of emptiness to be able to progress on the path. Does that answer?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, but I don't
Okay.
have time.
Yeah.
I have a question about the PUI. You said that you study by a teacher, like at school, but the way I see it, this is something that everyone born, let's say in the West,
for sure.
is actually, that's what it starts with. In kindergarten, in schools, you learn to know oneself and then you empower yourself, that kind of self. Is that what it means? That you know that it's not that?
Not necessarily. I mean, if you ask just somebody on the street, do you have a permanent, independent, unitary, independent self or soul? I mean, some people may say, "What are you talking about?" Some people may say yes. I mean, it's usually the
The West people will say
The West
yes.
people
Because
say
I
yes.
think the way they
unless
educate
they're
you,
materialist.
they educate you on this self.
הם יגידו שלא.
No,
Line
no.
unitary?
בוודאי, עם הגוף, only
That's
materialist.
how I thought.
כן, רק הגוף נקרא.
The idea of numero uno, I am numero uno, is that idea.
I am number
that's-
one.
That's how the West, I mean, you grab more and more for yourself, you'll be happier. The more you grab, the more you'll be happier.
But it may not be that PUI self. It may be one of these others, a substantially existent self.
So
It
doesn't
may
have
be.
to
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, everybody believes in itself, even animals, okay? Even a dog, you know, they feel, I am important, there's a bone, I'm going to get it before some other dog gets it, you know? I mean, they have a sense of self, but it's, you know, it's not this permanent unitary independent self, it's more of a innate,
Yeah.
inborn, grasping at I. So it could be, yeah.
What is the difference between unitary and independent? Like
Unitary means doesn't have parts. It can't be divided up into parts. It's like one whole thing.
and independent is
Independent in this context means independent of causes and conditions. It doesn't arise from causes and conditions. So it's like always been there. Always been there, always will be, is not affected by anything else, not dependent on anything else, self-contained sort of, self-contained.
Okay.
But people would say, I'm my thoughts.
Huh?
People would say, I'm my thoughts.
My thought.
my thoughts.
I am my thoughts, yeah.
People say that.
Yeah,
Even if I tell them, okay, but your thoughts are changing, so what about you? Okay.
well, how about if we go on and look at the second type of self, and then maybe it'll be a little more clear. this middle one, the coarse one, self-supporting, substantially existent self. Okay, so it's on the paper here. We can just read from that. Bottom of page 2. So just to explain the terminology, which is a mouthful of words, but it's not really that difficult. So the meaning of self-supporting means it's somewhat independent of the aggregates, our body and mind. Not totally independent, but a little bit independent. So that's the meaning of that term. And then substantially existent. This is a term that comes up in Buddhist philosophy. It's a little bit complicated, but if we look at examples, it's easier to understand. So something that is substantially existent is able to appear to the mind without other things having to appear. An example is a tree. Now this is not talking about Madhyamika, put them aside for now, but let's remember the two Hinayana schools who believe that things exist objectively, okay? So they would say a tree is really out there, over there, completely separate from me, independent of me. It's there, and I can just come along and look at it and see it. It appears to me and I see it, okay? So a tree is able to appear to us without other things, meaning things other than the tree having to appear. Now, to make that clear, we contrast that with a forest, okay? So a forest, how do we see a forest? Or how do we experience a forest? Is it something we can see with our eyes? Can we see a forest?
Many trees.
Trees, okay. To be able to see a forest, we have to see trees, and then forest is just labeled or imputed on that bunch of trees. So to see a forest, we have to see trees, and trees are not the forest. Okay, does that make sense? So that's, I mean, there's lots of other examples. For example, army. Okay, we say army, but can we see an army? You know, army is just like a name or a label given to a bunch of soldiers. There has to be a certain number of soldiers usually with weapons and uniforms and gear and all that kind of thing. Then we can say army. Okay, so we can see a soldier. That soldier can appear to us on his own or her own. But to say army, to see an army, we cannot see an army without soldiers appearing. And the soldiers themselves, each individual soldier is not an army. Okay? So if that makes sense, then it's kind of similar with a person and aggregates.
Right.
Okay? So we have, well, for aggregates, let's just make it simple, body and mind. Okay? So each one of us, each person has a body and a mind. Although we can't usually see the mind, we can see the body. Okay? So when we say we see a person, what we are seeing is their body. And the body is not the person. According to Buddhism, you might disagree, but according to Buddhism, I mean, I think most people would agree, you know, a person is not this body, which is made of skin and blood and flesh and bones. I mean, you know, there's a lot more than that to a person. So a person, like Shuki, for example, Shuki is similar to the forest, okay, or the army. It's the thing that's labeled onto the body and mind. So when you have a body and mind, a combination of a body and mind sitting in a chair there, okay, and we know that guy's name is Shuki, okay, so we can say, I see Shuki sitting over there. But what we're actually seeing is not Shuki, we are seeing Shuki's body. So Shuki's body is something substantially existent, like the tree or like the soldier. Yeah, Shuki's body, Shuki's aggregates, we could say they are substantially existing. But Shuki, the person, Shuki, is not substantially existing. There's another term, I don't know if I put it down here. imputedly existing, imputedly existent. Okay, so something that can't appear to us on its own, but only through other things appearing, like the forest, or the army, or a person. Those are said to be imputedly existent. They exist only imputedly. They're just imputed, rather than substantially existent. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a new concept, but I think if you use those analogies, like the forest and the tree, army and a soldier, okay, it helps.
Don't use Suki.
Okay. Next time we use tall, or Anna, or SK, whatever. So all Buddhist schools, all the Buddhist schools agree that a person does not exist substantially. If a person existed substantially, we would be able to see a person on its own without the aggregates appearing, without the need for body and mind aggregates to appear. So, for example, here in this empty space, we don't have any aggregates. We don't have a body and mind combination. If a person was substantially existent, we could see a person here without the need for aggregates to appear. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in other words, it means a person can exist independent of aggregates, can be seen independent of aggregates. So that's the meaning of a substantially existent person. So it sounds complicated when we talk about it, but what it said, what Buddhism says is that we have an innate, inborn sense, feeling of a substantially existent person. We do feel I, me, exist in a substantial way, not just in an imputed way. Now, if we go down below that, the last paragraph, the conception of such a self involves thinking or feeling that there is an I or self, which is like a boss of the aggregate. So this is how it actually appears in our experience. And you might be able to identify this. You might be able to, this might sound familiar. A feeling there's a boss, a CEO, a director inside. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah? Up here, for me it's like up here, you know? It's like there's something up here that's kind of running this machine. making all the decisions, you know, moving my body, making my mind do this and that and so on. It's like a boss or a director or a CEO, something that's in charge, something that controls the body and mind. Okay, so if you ever notice that feeling of self, that sense of I in that way, that's the substantially existent self. And it doesn't seem to be completely separate from the aggregates, like something that could be totally removed from the body and mind and stand by itself. It's not that coarse. That's one meaning of coarse. And that would be a very coarse, a very gross idea, to think that the I could be totally separate from the aggregates. So we don't feel that way. Because if you look at it, you know, we always feel our I wherever our body is, you know? I guess there are people who have out-of-body experiences or have lucid dreaming, and they say that they, you know, they see themselves out of their body, looking back at their body. I don't know how common that is. I've never had such an experience, but some people have that experience. They would say, I think in the Tibetan tradition, they say it's the subtle mind that does that, the subtle mind that does that. Anyway. So most of us, most of the time, we feel our I here, where our body and mind is, right? Where our aggregates are. My body is sitting in this chair, and so I feel I am sitting in this chair. If my body gets up and walks out of the room, I feel I am getting up and walking out of the room. So we feel our I right here, where our body and mind are, okay? So we don't feel we are totally separate from our body and mind. We feel we are somehow connected with our body and mind, and yet still a little bit separate. So the analogy is that of a group of salespeople, let's say that, like real estate. Let's say there's a real estate office. You do real estate, right?
Well, I do customer service, real estate. Yeah,
Anyway, let's say there's a group of people in an office and they're all selling real estate. So they're all doing the same kind of work. But there's one person who's the boss. Maybe he started the company, he or she started the company and pays the wages and, you know, whatever.
And don't sleep at night.
Whatever, I don't know. The boss, the head person, okay. But that person is not totally separate from the others because they're all doing the same work. They're all doing the same job. So they say that analogy can illustrate this sense of a self in relation to the body and mind. This sense of self doesn't seem to be totally separate from body and mind. It seems to be somehow part of the body and mind, but a little bit superior, kind of in a superior position, superior in the sense of being in control, being the director, being the boss. So that's how it appears in our experience. And also it said that it seems that the aggregates depend on the I, but the I does not depend on the aggregates. So it also has that kind of a sense, you know. I'm in charge, body and mind depend on me, but I don't depend on them. Something like that. That's how it's explained in the texts. So the job here is to look for this in our experience, the object of negation. Try to look for that sense of an I in our experience, and when we get a sense of it, a picture of it, a feeling of it, and then use some reasoning to investigate if it's true or not. So that maybe after the break, we'll have one more break, maybe after the break we can do a meditation on this, just to see how it could be done. On the top of the next page it says there are two forms of this conception of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. One is innate. That means everybody has it, even animals. So we're born with it. And the reason we're born with it is because we had it in past lives. So we had this conception in all our previous lives. It's always been part of our mind. And so it's still there when we're born. We're born with it. We're born with that sense of an I. Everybody has it. But there's also a form that is acquired, meaning that you might attend some course of philosophy or religion or whatever that teaches you that you have this kind of self. So the two forms, so maybe that's what you're talking about, you know, this, in the West, okay, we already have an innate, instinctive sense of an I, but then that's further reinforced by things that we learn in our education system. You are really important.
Don't be a dirt ball.
Don't be a what?
A dirt ball.
Dirt ball?
Then I've never heard this expression.
Dirt ball?
A mat.
No.
A mat.
Mat.
Doormat?
Doormat.
Don't be a doormat. Stand up for yourself. Be independent. Things like, I don't know. Yeah.
Have elbows. This is what you say in Israel.
Yeah, exactly.
You should have
Develop
elbows.
your ego.
Oh,
And develop that self.
I see.
Empower that self.
Okay.
That's what
Well, I guess I have a different education. I went to Catholic schools. No, but, you know, there it was probably the first kind of self that was reinforced. After, you know, you're going to die, but your soul will live on forever, either in heaven with God or in hell, burning in hell with the devil. So, you know, watch out. Be a good girl.
But I think in Judaism it is quite the same. That like there is inherent soul,
Yeah.
which goes up somewhere, I don't know.
you
We
feed
hope-
it all
we
the
hope.
time. You feed that soul.
The soul, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If we have the aggregates that are the body and the mind, and the I that is like the boss of the aggregates, so what is that?
Well, that's what we have to investigate. Because according to Buddhism, it doesn't exist. It's an illusion. It's not true. So, but we have to come to that ourselves. We can't just say, oh, Buddha said it doesn't exist, therefore it doesn't exist. We have to check.
What's the whole thing with incarnation? I think I already asked it.
The whole thing with what?
With incarnation.
Oh.
If there is not that subtle thing that goes. So.
Yeah, actually, after that last session, I was thinking about this and thinking, but why do you think that just because there's reincarnation, rebirth, there has to be a permanent self? Is that
So what is the thing
is that really required in order for reincarnation to happen? The mind. Not the whole of the mind, because our mind is very complex. It's full of all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, the way it's explained, and actually the best explanation is in Tantra, in Tibetan Buddhism. Have you heard this explanation of the 8 stages of death? When you die, you go through these 8 stages, and as you go through these 8 stages, the mind goes from a more coarse or gross level to more subtle level, finally to the very subtle, they say the most subtle level of the mind, which is the clear light mind. The most gross level of mind are the senses, 5 sense awarenesses, seeing, hearing. So those shut down. They don't, I mean, they don't like go out of existence, but they just kind of become dormant. They kind of collapse. They don't work anymore. And this is something you can see. Actually, once, many years ago, there were these Irish, who were these guys? IRA? Irish Republican Army. You know, the ones who were fighting against Britain. And some of them were put into prison and went on a hunger strike, you know, and they said, we're not going to eat until our demands are met or whatever. And they just starved to death. Nobody met their demands, so they starved to death. So I read an article about sort of how they died, you know, like what kind of changes. Kind of, yeah, it was quite, I mean, not every single aspect of it, but what I found interesting was that they went blind. They would go blind, which is what is explained in the 8 stages. That's the first sense to go, the sense of seeing.
There's a movie about it, exactly.
Yeah, a documentary or a...
Which movie?
I think it's called Hunger.
Hunger?
Ah, about this, okay.
Anyway, so
So
they would first
so there
lose
is
the
that line,
sight.
yeah.
Anyway, so it's just kind of a support for this explanation of the 8 stages. So, so our senses go, and then the next thing to go is conceptual thoughts. You know, all our, you know, I am this and I am that, and this person is my mother, this person is my father. About all these conceptions that we have, they go, and then the mind gets more and more subtle down to this, what they call the clear light mind. It seems that's only explained in Tantra. It's not explained in other aspects of Buddhism. So they say that is the thing that leaves the body and goes to the next life. And it's a very, very subtle, it's a subtle mind, but it's not a soul. I mean, it's not this kind of permanent, unitary, independently existing soul like the others.
It sounds like it is, because you say that,
I'm just sharing my you know, I know
Yeah,
that
no, that's fine.
I'm a beginner, but and not a smart one. But for me, you know, if you said that there, not you, if the tradition said that there is that light that goes, this energy, I would call it, so that there is the thing that is there and it's inherent and you need to go from life to life. I'm not.
Well,
just saying
inherent, that's something we have to check. When we get to this one, what the meaning of inherent. Because the Madhyamika Prasangikas who understand this process of dying, they would say, yes, there's this very subtle mind that goes from life to life, and that is the mere I. They would say that is the person, the mere I. But it doesn't exist inherently. It's not permanent in the sense that it changes. It's not a permanent, unchanging thing. It changes. It depends on what you mean by permanent. You know, the term permanent can be a little confusing because for some people permanent means always existing forever. And in Buddhism, the meaning of permanent is more unchanging. That's the meaning of permanent. It doesn't change. So something which is permanent stays the same. It never changes. It's always exactly the same, like static, frozen. That's the meaning of permanent. So this very subtle mind of clear light isn't permanent in that sense because it's changing. It's mind. The nature of mind is it's changing all the time. However, it is permanent in the sense of existing forever, eternal. Maybe it's better to use the word eternal. It always did exist, it always will exist, it will never go out of existence. So it's eternal, but while being eternal, it's changing, and it's also empty of inherent existence. So we'll look at that later. So you can call it a soul if you want to, and in fact, have you heard of Robert Thurman? Robert Thurman, he's father of Uma. But he's a professor of Buddhist studies at Columbia University in New York. Really amazing guy. You should try to find him on YouTube. He's hilarious. He did a translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. You know the Tibetan Book of the Dead? Yeah. There's a number of translations. So he did one translation of it. And in the foreword or the introduction to the book, he used the word soul for this very subtle mind of clear light. And I was like, what? I mean, usually Buddhists try to avoid the word soul. Oh, there's no soul in Buddhism. And here, Buddhist professor using the word soul. But he has his own sort of vocabulary as well. He's very creative. Makes up his own words. So, but anyway, it just shows you can, if you want to, use the word soul for the little subtle mind of clear light, as long as you understand that it's not the same as the soul of Judaism or Hinduism or Christianity, this unchanging, inherently existing thing. As long as you understand what it is and how it exists, you can call it a soul if you want. Because it is something that goes from life to life. That's the thing that takes rebirth. That's the thing that goes to enlightenment as well. It will still be there when we're enlightened. It's the thing that becomes enlightened, according to Tantra.
I'll think for it.
I want to connect this to the merely labeled I, which is the most subtle,
The smallest doll. Yeah.
So what it is actually, not what it is not, but what it is
The merely, what is the merely labeled I? Well, that's actually very difficult to understand. It's merely labeled. It's just a name or a label given to our aggregates.
No, but
it's not a thing existing on its own in its own way, independently from its own side. It's just labeled. You have a set of aggregates, body and mind, and then you call it Sarah or Alan or SK or
and
Shiki.
how does it connect to the light, this most subtle energy or awareness goes between?
Well, that's also merely labeled. We haven't come to this one yet, so let's, next time, in our last session, we'll be looking at that, what it means to be merely labeled as opposed to inherently existing. And again, it's not easy, it's difficult. But if we go a little more, this way, through the coarser levels, it can be easier. Is that okay if we hang on to the...
Only 15 minutes and we know it?
15?
We're
We
done.
have to wait
No, we're not.
just for the break and then we will know.
So next
No, I mean next session, next
Break,
2 weeks time.
2 weeks time,
The next
to my-
time we meet.
lifetime.
I mean, if we have time today, I can start talking about it, but first I wanted to go through this substantially existent self. Somebody else had, oh yeah.
I just want to ask you, in the clear light, the self, it holds some scars? Or
Yeah.
it's not connected to?
Yeah, so this is another big question. Our karma, we do actions, we create karma, and the karmic imprints, karmic seeds go into the future for thousands, millions of lifetimes. They're never lost. So where are they? So they would be on this, I mean, Madhyamika says the mere eye. It's the mere eye that carries karmic imprints, which I always found really frustrating, you know. I just, what do you mean the mere eye? Just a label carries these imprints? So they would say, no, of course there's a mind, there's some kind of mind, either this very, you know, the very subtle mind of clear light, which is only explained in Tantra, not in Sutra. So in Sutra they would say it's the very subtle mental consciousness that goes from one life to the next, and that's the mere eye. And that's what carries the imprints from one life to the next. Yeah. How about a break? And then after, merely labor break. So after the break, we'll try meditation on this substantially existent I.